Welcome. This is Elizabeth Fulgaro. With me today is Chaplain Lisa Northway, U.S. Army, and we're continuing her story of her walk with God through her chaplaincy, her call to chaplaincy in the U.S. Army. Thank you for being with us again, Chaplain Lisa.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm interested. Before you ended up at Fort Hood, I'm sure you've had several other assignments stateside. Is there one that stands out that you could share with us today?
There's so much significance in the interactions I've had. Um, Certainly, being overseas in Germany was a dream for a small town girl from the Central Valley of California. Would have not been able to do that outside of the Army, and then an overseas assignment, what's considered overseas, even though it is our country, is being in Alaska and not being a cold weather person and not looking forward to that experience, but asking if indeed I could have it because my husband was already up there as a director of religious education from the Army up farther up, and the closest they could get me to him was an hour plane ride away. It was about a 7-hour drive, and we were thankful, and we're always thankful, of course, when the chaplain corps, the Army can consider that might be a good thing for a husband and a wife to be together when possible.
maybe that's why they got married. Maybe
they really are better together. And I would say that some of those excitements, the excitement things about wherever I'm at, is the privilege and the honor of getting to work with people in the middle of life and death issues. And those situations that no one would ask for, to be intimate in a situation close to the death of a loved one or a tragedy of a loved one, and yet having the privilege and the possibility, as they are willing to have me alongside for that part of their experience, whether they are facing their own death or the death of a loved one.
That's a difficult place to be. It's also extraordinary privilege to be that chaplain, to be that presence of God next to them. And I know you shared a little bit of what that was like on deployment. And have there been situations like that or assignments like that stateside?
Absolutely. While we're, losing our comrades on the battlefield, we are also have families who are trying to absorb the reality that daughter or son or husband or wife will not grow old with them, will not be the one that takes care of them in their old age, will not be the one sharing the joy of nephews and nieces and grandchildren with them.
And so have there been any particular assignments related to that allowed you to be that presence on a more concentrated level?
Certainly, I think the most concentrated level would have been at Fort Carson, following coming back from that Iraq deployment. And I had about 6 months before I needed to report to the next place. And I was allowed to work at the division level in a pilot program that the garrison commander wanted to try, in the intensity of the fact that there were so many lives being lost, so many soldiers dying, and that Gold Star, Families of the Fallen Community, was growing faster than anyone could have comprehended. And I was told that I would only have 6 months, but they wanted to see what a difference they could make in the care of the community if they had a chaplain whose sole duty, main duty, was to take care of these families, not as an additional duty as it's usually done with whoever the family life chaplain is, or maybe another person who's given that role. And I remember being asked if I would be willing. And I, being fresh from the deployment and being up close and personal with death death of soldiers, certainly there was a sense of dread, like, oh, but there was also in me, I realized that this was the completed part of the picture. This is the rest of the story, and I could not say no. There was no way I could say no to the question if I would be willing. This is indeed the fuller picture of what I've signed up for. And I remember that first time being ushered into a room. I was told ahead of time, this is where the widows meet, when they meet weekly, and we need you to be in that space and, be their chaplain. And in my mind, I remember walking in there as I prepared, I was thinking, quite honestly, that I'd be meeting with a bunch of little old gray-haired ladies. Because that was
Yeah, not this war.
No, that was my perception of widows. Because growing up in the church, it was those women who lived 20 years longer, statistically longer than their husbands, and got together for prayer meetings and stuff. And this was a little bit more of a grittier group, and I say that in the vein of no grit, no glory, no grit, no pearl. And there was certainly a pearl to be had. As I caught my breath and tried to not show my shock, that I was looking around a room of 20 and early 30-something women. And saw them have an uncommon resiliency, a certain readiness for life that I would not have thought in that group. Their sense of humor sometimes appeared to be very dark. And I realized, though, but what we know from history, and we know, like, a lot of our comedians have come, they're generations of people who've come through the Holocaust, or their parents did, their grandparents did. And I said, there's something about that. So I had been to the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles, and I said, there's something about that. And but yet this isn't something that happened 50, 60 years ago. This happened in the last couple of years, in the last year, sometimes months, sometimes sooner than that. And yet these they're all in different places, respecting each other, but they're all honoring a common bond. What they say, they're all part of a group, all part of a club that they did not ask to be a member of. And I remember that I was just so struck, I think, more about the humor that was really their way to grapple. There was anger, and there was tears, and there were different situations they were having to deal with, sometimes with extended family members, loved ones, and the diversity of grief and all of that. But I remember walking away and needing to greatly debrief the humor. And I thought, wow, what is this thing that God has allowed us to face our worst fears and be able to laugh at that darkness? Only a holy God could do that. And I think he gives it, I believe it, according to a verse in Ephesians, I think Ephesians 6, where it says that God, Jesus went up to the high mountain, and he gathered. There's a word for it in military language in the Message version called booty, BOOTY, which stands for the plunder of war. And he redistributes to everyone. Everybody gets in on it. And I really think that speaks to whether a person acknowledges where they get that gift or not. They all get something. And I think there's something in that can be translated to this, even the horror, that there's something that we're given, a strength, a resiliency that can help us manage the true weakness we feel in our bodies, in our minds.
That makes sense. So it sounds like you were learning from them.
Absolutely.
What else did you learn from them?
that we all heal as differently as our own fingerprint. And some of us can make use of expressive arts, some of us can make use of counseling, some of us can co create events to honor our loved ones. Some of us can just show up and celebrate and remind each other our loved ones, our soldiers, our service members did not live and die in vain. They are worth remembering, they are worth celebrating, and you can ask for what you need and some things that you want, including getting together with a group of soldiers, a group of comrades who knew your son or daughter, husband or wife, or anyone in a different way than you did, and take them out to lunch and hear the stories that maybe you would have not heard otherwise if you have the courage to ask.
That's super good insight, because I think a lot of times people are afraid to approach someone who's grieving. They don't know what to say.
And likewise, I tell my soldiers, I said, when they tell me they're still hurting, or they know part of a story that they're pretty sure a family doesn't know, I ask them if they would have the courage. They can go through the Gold Star state office in each state, Gold Star family situation, and even see if that they can contact and see if that family or that loved one's open to meeting with them or creating a safe space. And I think I've only heard stories where they were so ready to hear it, and they did not want to. If it was being offered, they didn't want to lose that. There might be some hardness, but they would get to hear something, some funny story about how their own relative, their own loved one, had a sense of humor and all that quirkiness, stuff that it makes them so glad that other people got to appreciate them, even in their last days, their last moments.
So how did the job progress? Because you kind of started here, show up at the widows group. Where did it go? Where did the Holy Spirit open doors?
So I kind of just did a personal survey of what they would like, and they said, we need events that we can bring our kids to, so that we know the chaplain's not just there for us, but they're for our whole family. And I started getting questions, and I would go to the mothers group or the parents group, and I would say men and women in our culture, we know they grieve differently. So it was mostly mothers, but there'd be fathers that show up there too. But I was invited to events to pray, to give the invocation. I remember when a skateboard park was dedicated in honor of a fallen son, and that was one of his passions. And so the parents came together and helped build and had it dedicated in the town in Colorado. And that was such a privilege to be with these parents and loved ones who wanted to do something to say, you know what, he had a life outside of the Army too.
Yes.
He had a passion. He had a hometown that he could have easily conceived of coming back to, and he will still be celebrated here.
What happened when you had to leave that position? What was it like?
Oh, goodness. That was one of those rip your heart out kind of situations. I knew going into it, I was supposedly just going to be 6 months. And I knew going into it, it would change me forever.
Okay, so would you like to share any of how you were changed? Can you put it into words?
I feel like I became more of a whole person. I think it became in part of my own making peace on the way home from war. That, whether we live or die, we may not have been loved perfectly in a human sense, but we have been loved, and in some cases, well loved. We had people who dreamed with us, who dedicated us to God and hoped we would come back home. And it created, as well as the blessing of that, knowing them in that context, it also created the burden. It became more clarified. If we have the blessing of returning home from battle, we also have the burden of living out with dignity and respect the legacy of those who did not get to come home with us.
Is it heavy?
It is. It is not an unwelcome heavy. It seems like a spiritual responsibility heavy. And the beautiful thing that I get to experience for being willing, even though there's a part of me that was like, oh, it was one of those things like, if this cup could just be taken from me, if we just didn't need to do this, and yet knowing it had to be done, I had to walk through that with them. The blessing of that is some of those things that I didn't have language for, I have language for. I still talk to those mothers and family members and spouses and children, and I've had the privilege of being invited into parts of their lives I will never take lightly.
That's kind of a exquisite thing, right? Exquisitely hard and exquisitely beautiful at the same time. Where was God with you on that part of the journey?
He was with me and he was ahead of me because he was already with them.
Okay. All right.
It was obvious he had been there. So, and that was we know these things, we learn these things, we believe these, we have faith for these things. But to know, okay, God was with me on that deployment, but he was also back here while these people, these loved ones, were receiving their knock on the door. They were being told the news that they didn't want even let into their house. But they understood that there was a mission that had to be completed, and they were being offered an opportunity with the mission of continuing on, like many of us soldiers, the burden and the blessing of getting to live, whether we're not sure they wanted to live without that loved one, but doing the best they could with what they were given.
Is there anything that you can think of that the civilian community can do to make walking through the rest of their lives more comforted, more accompanied?
I'd definitely say that the civilian community could facilitate some of these conversations between the fallen, the battle buddies of the fallen, and the loved ones of the fallen, making it safe to have that conversation. It's a scary thing. It's a scary thing. And especially when maybe a soldier's been said, well, you can't talk about that part. There's an investigation. To help be able to continue to ask the question, well, what can we do? What can you do? Can you tell a story? Can you say something about how in some way, how that their loved one changed your life and changed how you look at the mission? And making it safe. Could a church or people of faith or people in the community host a meal, or or just even a private, intimate luncheon where it's protected space?
I think rightly, the Gold Star families that I know are very private, which I can relate to.
Mm-hmm.
How would a church even begin to try to connect with those families in a way that they would feel safe to respond?
Well, two things that come to mind. One is contacting the state headquarters, Gold Star families.
Mm-hmm.
If they're near in any kind of proximity to a military post, to get in touch with the survivor outreach services for that post, and especially if they're a group of people of faith that might have that chaplain connection, maybe the family life chaplain at each of the posts that are there that often work a little bit closer.
Okay, those are good. Thank you, Chaplain Lisa.
You're welcome.
We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.